Coming up as the NBA draft approaches, of course, Mikal Bridges is untouchable, right? I mean, right? We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And Doug, we have to ask the question. Is it that the Brooklyn Nets have already decided what their future is, and that's why they don't need to make any moves? Or could they still be considering what would be seismic shifts in their roster, specifically around Mikal Bridges?
I think we've always kind of known that while the front-facing sort of like company line around Mikal Bridges is, he's part of the future. We're going to build around him. We're going to bring in other stars. And I think that probably that is the main goal. But we also have over this time talked about the idea that even if it wasn't the main goal, that would be the only thing you said anyway, because you would never come out as an organization and say, well, we'll see. Maybe with Mikal Bridges, I'm not sure, blow us away, because you just never want to do that in terms of the public or just in front of other teams or whatever. So when we hear that Jake Fisher reports over Monday evening that says the Knicks, Jazz, and Rockets are three teams that have been checking in on Mikal Bridges' availability, it's one of those situations where like you said in the open, is he really untouchable? I think we'd all agree, of course not. Right? For the right price, he can be had. There's teams, there's guys on teams that no one would ever call about. No one's calling the Dallas to say, hey, what's Luka's availability? No one's calling Denver to say, hey, what's Jokic's availability? And there's that class of guys. Bridges clearly isn't in that class or anywhere close. So I think hearing rumblings that the teams are still thinking, let's keep calling because we don't know what we don't know what their overall level of commitment here, makes total sense to me. And the more these things come out, the more I think there is some chance that eventually some kind of huge offer comes in. The Nets say yes. I don't think it's likely, but it's for sure way higher than zero.
Yeah, I think that, to your point about the rumblings heading in towards the draft, that maybe it's a weak draft class. We said before that this draft class over the last month or so, I think you've seen 5, 6, 7 players that in different levels of spectrum. There's guys right near the top, but there's also players that were talked about near the back end of the first round that through some of the combine workouts, all of a sudden they're getting a little bit of steam. So there's enough probably names or prospects that you could look at if you are the Brooklyn Nets receiving some of these calls and maybe getting back some control. Maybe it is Houston with that pick 3rd overall. You go, okay, there's a real pivot opportunity here. The other side of it, when you mention Fisher and some of the rumored teams, I think get this one out of the way at the top. Have you changed your position? Because I have. I hate when I ask you a question, but don't assert my own opinion on it. I've changed my stance on the idea that the only way you trade Mikal Bridges is to Houston for all of your picks back. And while that's the best version, and while if Houston wants to make any type of version of that trade, it's the first one that you want to start in on, I do think that at a high level, to sit here as the Brooklyn Nets and say that's the only way that we would make a decision like this around Mikal Bridges, it feels like you are holding on to trying to correct a mistake. And if you're going to do that, then you may be short selling yourself on 2 or 3 other teams that have a lot of players, have a lot of picks, and can at least help you turn the corner if moving on from Mikal and other veterans is the plan you end up going with.
Yeah, I mean, these things always come down to what is the actual thing, right? So, it'd be crazy to say, no one would ever say it's only this or bust. It's just the easiest answer because that's the cleanest. The Houston thing is the cleanest fit. Right. And short of just going into infinity different examples of other things that we would say yes to, it's just easier to say that because oftentimes the other things are not realistic. But I mean, are there other deals out there that would make sense for the Nets? Of course. It's just sometimes the marriage of functional and reality, or or functional and fictional, doesn't always meet up because It's just like other teams aren't going to come in with those offers. So yeah, no, I don't think Houston's the only way to go here. There's probably a Jazz package, for instance, if that's one of the teams that could make sense.
Yeah.
If you really look at it with young players and some picks and some stuff like that, they might not be amazing over the next few years in the West. Like I think there's a lot of stuff that could line up. It's just sometimes it's just hard to outside of just going into these crazy scenarios that are unlikely to actually be pushed in front of Sean Marks and company. That's the reason we just always defaulted to the Houston thing. Makes sense because it's super, super clean. You get your back, you control your own draft destiny to a point, and you can kind of just see it like unfold in front of you a little easier.
Yeah, and I think that makes it interesting leading up towards the draft now. Houston, Utah, we all know that every single on the network, we know the guys that cover the Knicks have been knocking on the door just saying, like, listen, just speculatively, if we wanted to reunite all the Villanova guys, what would it take to do that? There's going to be those type of realistic, unrealistic versions of those trades. I will find it fascinating if we come away from this draft, and we're going to talk about leading into it here as we go forward today, but I would find it fascinating if we come out of this draft and we hear all the versions of all the packages, maybe from X number of teams that called Sean Marks and the Brooklyn Nets. And if I can go two ways with it, if the Brooklyn Nets, you hear, said they considered them, but ultimately couldn't come to an agreement or whatever it was. But if the idea is that we find out that definitively every call that was made to Brooklyn was simply them taking the calls, but never considering the offers that were being made on those calls, it'll be one of those moments again with Sean Marks and Joe Tsai where you go, well, then what are we doing here? Because then it means that you came in with blinders on. You were unwilling to assess legitimate packages to maybe go in a different direction. And you can look at that as being, okay, they made up their mind. This is the core they're going with, and 2025 offseason is the agenda. But I guess maybe it just comes back to whether or not we agree that's the best path forward versus looking at the options, getting younger, getting more draft capital, and saying, yeah, ultimately, we see the landscape. We're not going to be competitive over the next 2 years, maybe 3 years. Let's strike now when it seems like the value for Mikal Bridges continues to be at a pretty much all-time high.
Yeah, and so, and also the landscape's constantly shifting too around the NBA. Things you might have thought going into last season were going to shake out aren't shaking out possibly. It's like, Donovan Mitchell is gonna opt out of Cleveland. Well, that's looking more and more like he's going to resign there and get an extension. And you're like, okay, well, that was a big chip that we thought we could probably push in for. And maybe that's not going to be the case. But then you get like De'Aaron Fox, who's looks like he's not going to sign his extension right now. Is he going to shake loose in 2025? I mean, maybe. So then you start talking yourself into that, right? Or like maybe some of these younger teams made pushes earlier and these guys aren't going to be. These guys aren't going to be as available. The Bucks folded a little earlier than possible. So maybe Giannis could be there. I mean, like the landscape's always changing. So you're always trying to evaluate it. I will say the path of we don't have a star already and we're just waiting for other stars to come is very shaky ground to begin with. It's a little different when you already have a guy and you are just trying to find the next guy.
Mm-hmm.
Not having the guy yet has been a place where we've always failed to totally probably see the vision here. I think that's like that we've stood very strong on this one. It's like this star chasing thing is all good when you have a guy that you can and you're just trying to pair them. Every once in a blue moon, you get the KD Kyrie double dip free agent thing, but that just doesn't happen anymore. And so that's where we've always kind of stopped short on this. Hey, have a ton of cap space in 25 and plus the picks, and you're going to make it all work. And like, it takes a lot to have that to fall into place, a lot that's completely out of your control. And so while draft slots and draft picks are also kind of out of your control, it's in these two scenarios those seem a little more controllable. But with Bridges, I think this is something that they have to be just sort of like really hardcore thinking about. And I think that's why I don't think it's a mistake you're hearing these things like from Fisher and company constantly, like, hey, for a guy who's untouchable, he seems pretty touchable, right? So
it seems like I'm pretty close to touching this guy who says he's untouchable.
It's okay. I wish there was another word, by the way. I've run into this. We'll break here in a second, but I've run into this a few times where I'm like, I really wish there was another word because, like, besides untouchable, when it comes to like NBA players and stuff, because this is just one that just never feels like it sounds amazing when you say it, but hey, that's a context thing. All right, we are going to get a little bit more into where Bridges could possibly land should the Nets do it. Will there be a move made? whether Bridges or somebody else leading into the draft. We'll get into that here in a second. First, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Look, we all love sports. We love them so we just never want them to stop. Sometimes the summer can feel like it's a little bit of a downtime. The NBA season's over, NHL season's over, the playoffs have wound down. We're getting fewer games, but that's what the sports aren't stopping sports. And over on FanDuel, FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. They got stuff rolling all summer long. Obviously, MLB, you can put a bunch of the same game parlays together. They have player props and just about every stat you could think of when it comes to MLB, WNBA as well. Got soccer coming all summer long as well. All you got to do is open the app, dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to make the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
And as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, we remind you, get over to YouTube, get in the comments. What is an alternative to Untouchable? Because frankly, we want to have these discussions on the podcast, but it's not, there's got to be something better. I don't know what it would be. Maybe Unobtainable. Who knows for sure?
There you go. Unobtainable. That's let's go with that one. It doesn't roll off the tongue as cleanly, but let's use that one from now on.
It doesn't roll off the tongue as cleanly, but the alternative sounds a little dirty. So that's the weird part here, right? That's why you switch it up. If Mikal Bridges shouldn't be untouchable or unobtainable, then when we look at these packages, do you think that there's a version of it when you look like at Utah, if you look at some of these teams around the league that would make sense for a fit? The thing that I come back to is probably maybe something that does hold me back a little bit in these discussions. We do the network internal mock draft. You could get some more information about this as it comes out. They may end up doing some, recaps of how it unfolded. And I went into it representing the Nets, trying to accomplish the objective of moving on from everybody. Let's tear this thing down. So it's Mikal Bridges, it's Cameron Johnson, it's Dorian Finney-Smith first and foremost. And without going into the full details of it, I accomplished that goal. I walked out of the draft with an additional 4 or 5 first-round picks, some swaps involved, another handful of second-round picks, and some young players. Now, to different levels in terms of expectation or where you think they are. But do you think that it matters for Brooklyn what they get back in these trades? I mean, we know it does, but short of it being Houston and all their picks, do you think it matters about young player that they can build with Cam Thomas around, they can re-sign Nicholas Claxton and then showcase our young core? Or do you think they solely would want to care about every single possible pick you could give me under the sun, every single contract that expires this season, and then we can move forward with an enormous cap space in 2025?
The biggest problem with the Bridges thing, from a just like a narrative perspective, is that he's the last guy and face of the sort of the failed KD, Kyrie, Harden trades, right? Because
what if they traded Bridges and kept Johnson as the face of the trade?
Well, and this is where they also run into I think what's probably a pretty sizable roadblock is that, what's left from the Harden piece? Well, a Philly draft pick that was, either Clowney or Dariq Whitehead. Okay. Could be good, but it's not really tied 1-to-1. Kyrie, what's the thing there? It's like, well, the Dallas pick hasn't come to fruition yet, and Spencer Dinwiddie's gone, and Dorian Finney-Smith may or may not be traded. So it's like, okay, what do we really get from that? And with KD, it was, okay, well, we got all these Suns picks. We can't really attach a face to those. We hope they're going to be good in the future. And it's Mikal Bridges, who came in and absolutely lit the world on fire in his first couple months, in a Brooklyn Nets uniform. I think trading him for picks, I mean, just forget salary matching, which you would have to do also, but trading just for picks just doesn't have. It's just so harder to sell. It's so much harder to sell, right?
But isn't okay? So, and I agree with you. And isn't that then the problem? If this is how the Brooklyn Nets are approaching it, well, then what are we selling them? And don't get me wrong, it's a product, and you need to sell tickets. I understand it. But if the idea is that you get hung up on, boy, that's going to be a hard sell. If you organizationally believe in the package that is primarily about picks and future faces potentially of the franchise, then it feels like you're getting caught up in the PR battle of it all to be like, well, if we don't have someone to sell to the fan base right now, then it's going to be hard to just say wait 2-3 years, which it will be. But best offers are best offers for a reason. It doesn't always have to be about what's the PR angle of this.
I agree. I agree. I'm not
I know
saying
you're representing the Nets here. Yeah, I know you're not.
Yeah,
Talking.
I'm speaking strictly what I think is probably the thought process,
Yeah.
and it makes sense. Like there's a cognitive bias around wanting to like sort of maintain a level of, look what we did in the
Mhm.
face of sort of like player star adversity when it came to KD, Kyrie, and Harden, right? Did we weather the storm and get like real functional NBA guys back, or is it just going to be up to our draft acumen later on to kind of figure it out? It's much better to have both, obviously. And when Bridges becomes the guy, then you are probably going to end up overvaluing him just on that alone. I get it. I'm not actually even blaming them. I'm just saying that this is probably this is what's got them stuck in between. If like they he's the last guy, like there's no one left. Like, what do they get? They got some picks and they got a bunch of guys who are kind of out the door already. And
Mhm.
that's gonna and by the way, Bridge is like a great dude and the
Yeah,
contract's
yeah,
great and
yes.
he's really, really good. Like there's other things here. It's not just like he's just some bum that came over. Like he's a really good player on a great contract, by all accounts, an amazing dude. Like this is just the kind of guy you want to sort of like refashion some of the narrative around your franchise, but that's like not going to mean as much to other teams. So therefore,
Yeah.
the deals that come in just aren't going to be anywhere close to like how the Nets value him.
And that's part of, I think, the problem here too for Brooklyn is when you make those trades for the superstars, Kyrie and Kevin Durant, when it's Mikal Bridges that comes back in, I think there's two ways you could have gone with it. Now, obviously, it represented, well, we got back not only picks, but also very good players we believe we can build around. But you also committed, like maybe overcommitted to that narrative. Mikal Bridges is the new face of the organization, and he's going to be the core going forward. Then over that year and a half, you see that okay, he's a great guy and he represents everything you want for the organization. He's a very good player, but he's obviously not going to be or shouldn't be or can't be the first or second best player on your roster if you want to really achieve something. So now you shift it a little bit. Okay, well, Mikal Bridges is a great guy and he's a great player. And if you just wait 2 years, then we'll get the next layer of this deal. And in the interim, I think if you're a lot of the fan base potentially, excuse me, I always get choked up when I talk about the fans, emotional, they support us. You look at it and say, well, okay, Mikal Bridges at 27 is a little bit different than Mikal Bridges at 29 and 30. Like,
Yeah.
so when you move the timeline a little bit on where the expectations are, that's where I then think you start to get the rumbling from the fan base and you start to get the speculation from the NBA of, so what is really the goal here? And while I think it's fine, and that first couple of months that looked so good for Mikal obviously got us all very excited, you probably would have been better suited to say, we're very excited about the players we got in return and about what it will offer for us in the future to continue to reshape the franchise. If you did that and then said nothing going forward, you could sit here today and say, yeah, we're looking at offers for Mikal Bridges because we haven't attached this perception about what he means to the organization. And I think the Nets have always, sometimes in a good way, been concerned about representing the organization and how they want the organization to be seen.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes, in a negative way, override what should be smart decisions or what should be progressive moves for the Brooklyn Nets. Coming up here in a second. Quiet, Doug. We'll go ahead and see how Doug feels about my perspective there, and also answer the question ultimately, do the Brooklyn Nets stand pat or blow this bad boy up heading into the draft this week? We'll get into it in just one moment. Okay, so we want to turn here and ask that big, bold question about what the Nets will ultimately do, Doug. But do you, in terms of that perception and PR battle and maybe labeling Mikal a certain way, do you think that the Nets are having a little bit of remorse on selling that version of this team a season and a half ago?
Well, yeah, because I forgot the one other piece I wanted to add before we get to this final draft
Yep.
piece is that the other guy, he's so forgettable at this point because it was supposed to be Simmons. That was like this guy. That was like
Sorry,
the
who?
next. It was actually supposed to be Ben Simmons. That was the face
Ben
of the
Simmons.
yes. And I went all through the stuff they got back from all those trades, and I never even mentioned him, which is sad because I'm just like he's just so far afield of like thinking about him as like a functional piece of the organization. When it also goes so bad on that front too, then you start weighing these other guys even more. You weigh the other stuff more. Because I just,
Right.
again, I went through all this stuff they got back on all these trades. I didn't even mention him. He was like easily the biggest piece, like
Yeah.
of all the stuff they got back. And it's flamed out in such a spectacular fashion. So just wanted to throw that in there, be remiss without mentioning that, like, his flame out actually contributes more to the Bridges piece also. Is that
Yes.
like
Yes.
we swung and missed so bad on that one that now Bridges gains even more value
And
to
this would
us
be
than
the
it would be to
difference.
other people.
This would be the difference here too, in terms of areas where I think the Nets organization made a mistake, because by the time you make that trade for Kevin Durant and the Suns, you've already kind of had the problem with Ben Simmons and the injuries and being healthy and
Yeah.
available.
Yeah.
So if your narrative building was, we're going to get Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson, then Ben Simmons, he'll be 100% healthy. He'll be our second best player, our first best player. He'll be the lead guy, and these guys will support. Well, then I'm sorry. You were already constructed, you were working with popsicle sticks when you're trying to build a sound foundation for a real house, right? Like, you can't go forward with that type of thought process in that moment. Now, you can also say that if you're the organization, you're coming out of having superstars and all of a sudden they all want to leave for various different reasons. You go, I wasn't exactly thinking clearly. I was just kind of hoping something would come out of this where we didn't look like a franchise that very briefly had superstars, did not achieve any level of success that we anticipated, and then ultimately had to blow it up. And now know that coming up, we may be looking at a weird kind of handful of years where we've got a lot of picks, don't have our own pick control, players that are good but not great, and we're in this ambiguous space. So I can see that part of it. I don't even mean this negatively. I'm sure fans react to it a certain way, but running an organization, having your job, doing whatever you're doing in your life and going, well, that did not work out the way I anticipated.
Yeah.
Like, and what am I going to do now? I think that that's a big part of what's happened for Brooklyn.
Oh, it's the
Everything
biggest
that's
thing.
happened for Brooklyn.
It's everything. It's everything. It's
Brooklyn would love
this is
to
why I
have
think
Kevin Durant right now playing out the back end of his career, right? Like, I mean, we talk about like him going to Phoenix. It's like, that's the dream. Even if they weren't winning championships, just still having Kevin Durant and playing, high level basketball and being in the playoffs and selling seats. That would have been a version of the dream.
And by the way, and like this is why heading into this draft, I think that like it's funny because I think other organizations and fans too see this in a totally different way. So actually, what's part of probably the frustration or the head scratching or hair pulling like version of this is with whoever you are, whether it's other team, a fan, or whatever, is that everyone else doesn't see this situation with the same cognitive bias that probably the Nets do.
Yeah.
Which is, like, because they're like, I think for a lot of other people, if you're an independent thought person, it's like, hey, I think we know what we should do here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that this should be like, it didn't work. It's time to sort of blow it up, reset. We haven't done this in 20 years or whatever.
Right.
And like, it's just time to try to reset the deck as much as possible. But we're not in the building, and so and that just is always gonna be a harder thing. It's like whenever why you value your house a certain way. It's why you value the stocks you bought differently. Like the ownership bias you have around something is much different than someone just looking at your portfolio and be like, hey, well, why are we still holding here? Like,
yeah.
It's
why you think it's why everyone thinks their kids are so impressive, right? It's like, totally.
That's a good example. Yeah, that's another good example, right? It's like, those things are always going to retain a higher value in the eye of of whoever is, seeing them and dealing with them on a daily basis. And that probably has happened to a pretty significant degree here. There is a story, like we said at the beginning, where this could still work, right? 2025, you hold out for one more year, blah, blah, blah. So it's not all that, but I do think that it's been they've probably unreasonably weighted their situation and probably maybe the wrong direction.
One thing here as we close out, and I want to ask that, do we think ultimately the Nets do make a big move? Is there something surprising here? Because as we know, usually when it's all quiet for Brooklyn, it doesn't tell you one thing or the other. They are tight-lipped, and then the thing happens, whether it's a trade or otherwise. A note about the internal mock draft scenario where I was trying to clear the deck here. One thing that is worth mentioning is that in going through that process, the one goal that I also had was eliminating any type of money that I could. I'll break one thing here. Ben Simmons is still on the roster. I couldn't do anything with him. But everything I took back was either a young player on a low contract or a contract that expires this year. So while the Nets are already looking at 2025 offseason and saying we have a ton of money to work with, I went ahead and increased that by $30 to $40 million. Like, the Nets will have every single opportunity to go into 2025 with some young pieces on the roster, but to go in and look at the landscape and say, I'll take two superstars. I'll take two superstars and a high-level guy, whatever that may look like. I'll have 15 first-round picks to go ahead and throw at teams if I need to sweeten the pot. And I just wonder if that is a feasible version for the Nets where they go, hey, with all the money in the world and all the draft capital in the world, maybe we actually do rebuild this thing in a competitive way, and it looks completely different than anything that we see before us right now. Ultimately, do you think the Nets will field an offer for Mikal Bridges? before, in or around draft night?
No, I don't think they will. I just don't think it's going to happen. I mean, maybe post draft, something like that, like when things calm down a little bit, free agency shakes out, like we see some other, maybe some other things. I don't think leading into this draft, I think we're probably too close to it to see. I think they're probably, I think there's something with the Nets that probably makes sense where it's like, let's see how some of this other stuff shakes out. Like, let's see what happens in Atlanta with Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. Like, let's see what happens with, I mean, what are some of the other like major situations? Let's see what happens with Paul George. Like, let's see what happens, how some of these other teams end up shaking out. And I think that actually probably does benefit the Nets to be better late than early on some of those things. Cause there could be some ground, like Brandon Ingram. Like, there's other guys of varying levels of just like talent / superstar that are going to shift places here. And that's going to change the league, but not really change the Nets view of it. Or sorry, it's not going to change it like probably better or worse than Nets, but it'll just make it different and a new situation to look at. Let's see what happens with Garland. Let's see if Mitchell actually signs. Like, I think there's like no reason to probably at this point rush it unless they were like, hey, it's Amen Thompson and all the picks back. Right. But that's not going to happen. So like short of something like that, I don't think it makes sense for the Nets to like rush it into this because the landscape is about to change.
And one other thing that I know that I learned as well doing, I think internally with the network and then looking at the way teams are getting talked about, and the way players are getting talked about, is to make a decision about Mikal Bridges, even if it is a significant offer, even if it's not Houston. The behind the next step of that is, okay, Dorian Finney-Smith, Cam Johnson, let's start to strip this thing down. And I think it would be interesting to see how that unfolded for the Brooklyn Nets organization, communicating to the league that we're ready to move on, still wanting value, and then turning around and running into these issues, right? Of where do we evaluate a role player like Cam Johnson? It may all of a sudden become, oh yeah, pennies on the dollar for him as well. So I think there's probably a push and pull there for this organization too, around making sure you get the right value at the right time. And you could be correct that when the dust settles from the draft and some teams that wanted to go get a guy or wanted to make a trade for one of those other names, they may look over to the Brooklyn Nets. And who knows, maybe the value starts to spike again here. It's interesting to watch. The unfortunate thing, as Doug will wrap up here for us, is the Nets don't seem to be making any news or any waves heading into the draft tomorrow.
Well, I'll tell you right now what's going to happen. I'm going to call this. It's 8 a.m. on I just look at the clock wrong. It's Tuesday morning. Let's just say Tuesday.
Hold on. Here's what I'm going to do you. I'm going to learn how to read a
when
clock.
This goes.
Then I'm going to tell you what time it is.
Okay. I'm headed out of the house here. I'm going to be gone all day today, and I'm going to be gone almost all day.
Oh my God. Get ready
tomorrow.
Guys. Yeah.
This historically,
yes,
around these times when I know I'm not going to be around is when the Nets do something. Like, and so I know I'm not going to be able to do an emergency podcast for like a decent amount of like Tuesday and Wednesday. So you can almost guarantee that this is going to come up. You know why? Because it has Adam holding the bag on being able to do all the emergency content. So there you go, folks. If you want to look at any like little light coming off the ocean here as to guide you to shore, it's that I'm not going to be able to podcast here for the next 48 hours. So that means the Nets are probably going to do something. All right, we're going to get out of here. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube, because if something does break, Adam's got you covered live. We'll be going live on Locked On Nets over on YouTube. You got to subscribe so you know if it happens. Subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube.
Hard or impossible to get to or to get at. Why, that is the definition of unobtainable.
Oh, one of the alt. Who said that?
The dictionary. Webster.
Oh, okay, we got it. I can't call. We got to say who the poet is here. So let's try that again.
It is a part of the process. Hold on one
who
second.
Said it?
Yeah, give me a second. Hold on. Ready? Let's reset. Yeah. If you're watching or listening, you back up with us too. Hard or impossible to get to or get at. Why, that's the definition of unattainable from Webster's dictionary.
One of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.